Street protests are a rare sight in Malaysia, and it's even more rare to see young people taking part. But why? Around the world, despite oppressive laws, young people are often the loudest in demanding change.
You are under 18.
So are Malaysians just exceptionally peace-loving? Or is something else going on? In 2016, Malaysian Kira Yusri was a student at Western Michigan University in the United States. That year, while Donald Trump was on the presidential campaign trail, opposition politician Bernie Sanders brought his campaign to a university. Across the country, fellow Malaysian student Tharma Pillai also saw the effect the presidential election was having on students around him.
So my housemates are three guys who do not care about politics at all. But it's because they had the responsibility to vote. Therefore, they started researching, they started watching debates, they started reading up on policy, just to determine which is the better option to choose from.
Inspired, Tharma and Kira founded the Undi 18 movement, a campaign to lower the voting age in Malaysia from 21 to 18. In 2019, the Undi 18 bill was passed unanimously in the Dewan Rakyat.
Inilah kali pertama yang mana satu undang-undang diluluskan dengan semua pihak bersetuju.
The new bill not only reduced the voting age to 18, but allowed 18-year-olds to stand for election and introduced automatic voter registration. This means that if you're eligible to vote, you are automatically registered in the electoral roll. Check out your registration status at My SPR SEMA. Overseas Malaysians can register as postal voters online at the SPR website once elections are announced. The bill added 5.8 million new voters to the electoral roll, taking the total number of eligible voters for GE15 to 21.1 million. This is a significant increase. Some analysts call young voters the kingmakers. Take, for example, the Johor state election in March 2022. This was the first time 18-year-olds were allowed to vote, and voters under the age of 30 made up 28% of the electorate.
You look at UMNO, they represented almost 70% of new faces during the elections. Perikatan Nasional Pakatan Harapan had a whole list of young candidates below 40 years old. Anyone who's following the Johor politics scene will note that one, you had the youngest Menteri Besar, but most importantly, he chose perhaps the youngest team of EXCO in the history of the state of Johor. 100% of new faces, 70% of them were below 40 years old. So I think there is a direct impact in terms of Undi 18 into how political parties act, not only on a state level, but I also believe on the federal level once we see general elections.
But is this enough to bring younger people out to vote?
We just received this data recently that about 54% or a majority of voters between 18 to 21 years old actually turned out. And this was better than voters that were older, right? In the middle age group, which is 25 years old to 40 years old. So the younger or the first-time voters had a better turnout rate. So I think this is something that's very positive.
But 54% doesn't sound like a lot when we're used to voter turnout exceeding 70%.
Because there has been a structural break in how we calculate numbers. So before the Johor state elections, we are looking at numbers or voter turnout as a percentage of registered voters, right? So for example, we had 14 million voters, so it is a percentage of that number. However, because of the Johor state election was the first time where we had not only lowering the voting age, but also automatic voter registration implemented for the first time. Because of that, I think we really need to rethink and realign in terms of what is an acceptable or what is a good number of voters, essentially.
The fact is that many of these new voters, especially if they haven't registered before, may not be aware that they're now registered. There are various other reasons why people don't vote. But there's also a very specific law that has had a serious impact on political engagement in the country. Let's go to 1974, to the small town of Baling in Kedah.
In Baling, most of the farmers are rubber tappers. there was problem then because the price of rubber fell very low, and a lot of people found it difficult to sustain themselves. Stories went around that apparently 2 kids died because they ate some poisonous tubers. Apparently this was not so true, but this was enough to make people angry, and so they gathered to demonstrate.
Around 20,000 people marched in the streets, protesting the government's lack of assistance. The demonstrations caught the attention of university students who held their own solidarity march in Dataran Merdeka. But the authorities clamped down hard on the students' protest, and many were arrested.
About 1,000 people were detained, but they were detained for a few days. But 40 lecturers and students were detained for about a month, and 4 or 5, including me, were detained for about 6 years in the ISA. The reason why we were detained for so long was, I think, the government wanted to show example so that lecturers and students won't defy government. Of course, when you have all these problems, it makes many students less willing to come forward to act.
Making students even less willing to act was the 1975 amendment to the Universities and University Colleges Act 1971. The original act was created to organize the administration of universities, but the amendment prohibited students and lecturers from being active in trade unions and political parties.
I do believe that the University Colleges Act is one of the most destructive acts in the history of our country in terms of how it killed off basically 2 generations of leaders. Essentially, it shut off student activism. It made universities a place that were hostile to intellectual discourse. And let's not even talk about political discourse or political participation. And I think that universities are only now slowly recovering.
While change might be slow, it's also essential, as the new political reality means that university students are already politically active. They're registered voters. And although some had questioned whether young people were mature enough to vote, the fact is that political awareness has little to do with age.
I think the very unfortunate part about Malaysian democracy is that we really have not had a good political education, right? And I'm talking about multiple generations. For example, many people go and complain that your road has a pothole to your MP, whereas that's the responsibility of a local councillor. So I do strongly support the idea of engaging your politicians, because that's part of active citizenry. However, I think part of active citizenry is also understanding what are their roles, what are their powers, and therefore what are their responsibilities. And once you identify that, then you can channel your frustration, you can write letters, you can send emails, you can march up to their office in the right manner.
So as elections draw near, do you know your member of parliament, and do you know what they stand for? What is their track record in managing the economy, or building national solidarity, or uplifting the B40? Where do they stand on social services such as education, healthcare, public utilities? And how are they perceived in transparency and corruption? Young and old, the power of the vote is in our hands. The future of the country depends on your vote.